prisoners of war, and less than 10 years after the last group of survivors was released from Soviet imprisonment. This memoir served as the foundation on which this book is based. Many years after returning from the labyrinth of unnamed gulags and prison camps deep within the Soviet Union, the former Kurland soldiers found themselves increasingly haunted by recurring scenes of violent death in combat. Like many of the soldiers against whom they had fought, they lived with the unspoken guilt of having survived the cataclysm in which so many millions had perished, and they increasingly found themselves awakened by the incurable, recurrent chimeras of the battlefield. The nights were broken by nearby screams of dying comrades as they perished under the submachine guns and flamethrowers of Soviet infantrymen breaking through a thinly held line. The sight and sounds of enemy soldiers trapped within the confines of a burning tank only several meters distant could not easily be erased from the consciousness, and the intervening years did not serve to diminish the repeated episodes of horror. Through the writing of his memoirs, the former Wehrmacht officer attempted to soothe the psychological wounds and place the experience of war in a perspective that non-participants could share, and to which all veterans of that particular phase of the apocalypse could relate. Relying on his own memory, as well as sharing long-forgotten experiences with former members of his division, he brought together a manuscript that, with detached accuracy, effectively depicted the years on the Eastern Front as observed and experienced by the infantrymen. As G.H. Biedermann explained in the introduction of his original manuscript, it is of little value to restate many of the brutal historical occurrences that characterized, and in some regard has come to represent, World War II. It is not the intent of this book, through this omission, even to suggest that such events did not occur, nor does it serve the purpose of the book to place blame for the incidents of monumental importance and infamy that ensued. This is the story of the front as witnessed by the soldiers who fought there, and the events are limited within that same perspective. There is no examination of the causes of the war, nor can one detect underlying guilt, sorrow, or remorse for the undeniable political events and consequences that followed the German army throughout the Odyssey. Many years ago, Colonel Sepp Drechsel wrote of Krim Kurland, "The book is dedicated to the fallen, however it is written for the living." And it remains for that purpose that this edition of the manuscript has been translated and published. The task of conducting interviews, discussing events, and carefully examining aged documents and photographs with G.H. Biedermann extended intermittently over a period of several years. As translator and co-author of the account of those events that he experienced and witnessed during the war, I believe that several pertinent issues should be brought to the attention of the listener. I deemed it best to address most military ranks and units with the original German ranks and titles, so as not to detract from the traditional Wehrmacht military structure. Professional historians may disagree or find error with a number of occurrences regarding place names, strengths of opposing units, or specific dates of events. In that regard, it must be recognized that the primary sources of information for this book were gleaned from letters hastily written on the field of battle, yellowed photographs that resurrected long-forgotten names of individuals, and in some instances simply the fading memories held by Biedermann and a few surviving comrades who served with him in the East. Occasionally, official reports and unit war diaries were drawn upon for information regarding when and where a specific event might have occurred. Much of the information enclosed in the official documents and diaries stemmed from prisoner interrogations and documents captured on the battlefield. Thus, the official files themselves must not be regarded as infallible. Many of the official documents were provided by the widow and son of General Fritz Lindemann. The existence and availability of the Lindemann family documents are owed exclusively to the fact that when the Gestapo searched the Lindemann residence in Germany following the assassination attempts of Hitler, they overlooked the second Lindemann family residence near the Bodensee in South Germany. The general's personal files had been transferred to the second residence in Sturm in St. Peter some months before the assassination attempt. It is not the purpose of this book to stand solely as a source of knowledge and information for events pertaining to the history of the Eastern Front. It must be considered, however, an accurate chronology of experiences and events as observed and acted upon by an individual who credulously marched to the bidding of an evil ideology. The survivors of this march spanned immense distance from the role of invading conquerors to exhausted, isolated units locked in a fatal struggle against vast odds. And upon their experiences, history was cast an ever-darkening shadow. While living within this shadow, these surviving witnesses of history's greatest contest of arms and industrial power may present us with myriad lessons of survival and defeat in a malevolent world. It is our responsibility to learn from those events, and to heed the messages they continue to convey. Eric S. Zumbro, Dornstetten, Germany. Introduction. Any memoir of frontline ground combat in World War II raises two fundamental questions. Why did the author do what he did, and how did he endure it? Gottlob Biedermann tells a story increasingly unfamiliar at the turn of the century, a story requiring intellectual intellect as well as emotional response. Biedermann was a warrior for the working day. He was not a tanker or a pilot, but an infantryman. He served not in an elite division like the Grossdeutschland or the Panzerlehr, but in anonymous formations, whose numerical designations resemble entries in a telephone book. Biedermann won no high decorations, none of the medals Adolf Hitler presented in person. His 2 Iron Crosses, his Crimea Shield, his Close Combat Badge were more or less standard awards for an infantry veteran of the Russian front who lived to live. That did not make them easily earned. In 1942, Biedermann was in the front lines of the assault on the Russian fortress of Sevastopol, a close-gripped 6-month siege that cost the Wehrmacht 100,000 casualties, but that remains obscured by the drive on Stalingrad. In 1943, Biedermann and his division moved north, but in the final months of the epic battle for that city, when the correspondents and photographers had gone elsewhere for fresher stories, Biedermann finished the war in the Kurland pocket, part of an entire army group trapped against the Baltic coast by the great Russian It was while the 132nd Infantry Division was engaged in the vicious fighting in the swamps and forests of the Leningrad front that Biedermann was awarded more prestigious decorations. The German Cross in Gold, the Gold Wound Badge, and the Honor Roll class. He would later earn the Tank Destruction Badge during the closing months of the war. The most remarkable aspect of the latter awards is that the bearer, as a junior infantry officer, survived the numerous wounds and months of countless engagements required to earn their bestowal. Again, his experiences became footnote, this time in the final destruction of the Third Reich. Gottlob Biedermann is not typical, no archetype any more than for his counterparts in other armies. Yet Biedermann's war story is every man's war story, a saga of the everlasting high privates and junior officers who, in the words of Bruce Catton, have no hope of stars on their shoulders and scant hope for any of their families. Most English-language first-person accounts of World War II from the German side depict life among the high staff levels, the Luftwaffe's fighter units or Dönitz's U-boats, the Panzer divisions and the Waffen-SS. Johannes Steinhoff, Guy Saget, Michael Wittmann. Their stories appear and reappear on bookshelves and in footnotes. But most of the millions who served in the armed forces of the Third Reich had no celebration of their experiences and their sacrifices. They fought anonymously and died anonymously. Even the graves of those who fell in Russia were obliterated, some by a retreating Wehrmacht, others by a Soviet Union seeking retribution for its 20 million dead. Those who survived found, in a Germany seeking to rebuild morally as well as physically, few outside their families who had time for or interest in their stories. At the end of the century, Germany has nothing like the proliferation of published personal recollections, generated in the United States and Britain when veterans retired and opened footlockers and memories, or when children went through their father's things after the funeral. Those stories are by no means all triumphalist. Nevertheless, they describe a good war waged against enemies worth fighting and defeating. What can a German of the same generation say about his war? Biedermann's narrative is structured by the framework of the army in which he fought, by the nature of the right he served, and not least by a set of cultural and intellectual conventions vastly different from their British and American counterparts. The German war memoir had its genesis in the experience of 1914 to 1918. Like those of Britain, France, and the United States, it was the product of a political, largely middle-class group, the self-conscious and self-reflective. It also developed a set of conventions that strongly influenced the genre, because most war memoirists are neither authors nor intellectuals. Simply wishing to tell their story, they tend to do so in established frameworks. German memoirists of 1914 to 1918 tended to constitute a continuum characterized by cycles of destruction and renewal. The individual's war experience became a Bildungsgeschichte, a story of growth through a dialectic between personal engagement and organic communal processes. The Germans who recorded their experiences in the First War came overwhelmingly from a generation that regarded those earlier memoirs as O'Brien calls a truth war story, a construction depicting truths for which there are words. They adopted as well a style of writing that Germans call heroisch-pathetisch, not in the English usage of those words, but by employing a kind of elevated diction, combining romanticism and metaphysics. Too often this phrase translates into English as self-pitying, reinforcing a tendency of the British and U.S. to interpret the conventions of the German war memoir as expressing militarism and proto-fascism. French and British personal accounts of World War I focused on hate and betrayal, disjunction and fragmentation. The English-speaking world associates real memories of later conflicts with the disillusionment of Farley Moab, the matter-of-fact diction of Audie Murphy, or the antic post-structuralism of Jim O'Brien. Yet to borrow another of O'Brien's concepts, all war stories are false, but all war stories are also true. In Deadly Combat merits reading on its author's terms. Biedermann's terms are above all those of a frontline infantryman. In Deadly Combat was originally written not for general audiences, not even for German veterans, but for an in-group, the survivors of Biedermann's regiment and division. The author took no pains to explain organizations and terminologies with which his readers were likely to be intimately familiar. It is worth remembering as well that as a junior officer, Biedermann was not necessarily au courant with every aspect of his parent formations, any more than his American counterparts. Recent challenges to the authenticity of Guy Saget's classic Forgotten Soldier depend significantly on details of nomenclature, equipment, command, and location that were highly unlikely to be noted and remembered by a man in the ranks. The same held true for platoon and company officers. It is correspondingly appropriate to introduce here the German infantry of World War II. As in all armies, its first building block was the division. Creating homogeneous, interchangeable formations, German infantry divisions were organized and equipped in waves, or Wellen, no fewer than 35 of them in the course of the war. Gottlob Biedermann's 132nd Division belonged to the 11th Wave, formed in September 1940, for service in the Russian invasion Hitler and the High Command were already planning. It saw action in the brief Balkan campaign of April to May 1941, but its war really began when it crossed the Russian frontier on June 30th. It is then that Biedermann takes up his narrative. Initially, the divisions in each wave had slightly different scales of armament, depending on what was available in the arsenals or what the Reich was able to scrounge from its latest conquests. Some divisions marched into Russia armed with captured French anti-tank guns and with French vehicles in their supply columns. The anti-tank company in which Biedermann initially served depended, for example, on light French tractors, Lorraine Chenillette, to draw its guns. Organization was rather more standard than armament and equipment. The German infantry division consisted of 3 regiments, each with 3 battalions, for the 132nd, the 436th, 437th, and 438th Infantry Regiments, IR. It had an artillery regiment, 4 battalions, sequentially numbered 1 through 4, in contrast to the American fleet of 4 independent battalions under an artillery headquarters. Also in contrast to U.S. norms, the German division included an anti-tank battalion and a reconnaissance battalion with horses, bicycles, and a couple of light armored cars. In accordance with standard German practice, all of these units in the 132nd bore the division's number. Engineer, medical, signal, and supply services were essentially the same in the German and the U.S. armies, with one essential variation. German infantry divisions were almost entirely horsepower. At full war strength in 1939, a first-wave division, with top priority for material, had over 5,000 horses, but fewer than 600 trucks. The forced draft haphazard process of rearmament under the Nazis between 1939 and 1939 made it impossible even to consider developing Germany's auto industry sufficiently to motorize a mass army. The High Command, nothing if not logical, responded by designing a family of state-of-the-art horse-drawn wagons, with such refinements as ball-bearing wheels and rubber tires, for issue to units that would be marching anyway. The only major exceptions were the anti-tank companies and battalions, because they were expected to have to move quickly to counter enemy armor. Otherwise, throughout the war when the Lanzer rode, it was an exception to a general rule, and too often the sign of an emergency. Personnel casualties and losses of equipment led during the war to several modifications. The most important changes for the 132nd Division were the 1944 reduction of each infantry regiment to only 2 battalions, and the reconnaissance battalion's conversion to what was called a Fusilier battalion. For all practical purposes, a 7th Infantry Battalion directly under control of the division commander. The reduction in numbers was, in theory at least, compensated by new equipment. The best way of evaluating that process is by examining in somewhat more detail the structure of the 437th Infantry Regiment, in which Biedermann served for most of the war. Students of the U.S. Army in World War II will find little here that is unfamiliar. The U.S. Infantry Regiment of 1941 to 1945 was, on paper at least, almost identical to its German counterpart. Indeed, the tables of organization adopted by the United States in 1940 were conscious imitations of the German ones. Each German infantry battalion had 3 rifle companies and what was called a machine gun company, although, like the U.S. battalion's heavy weapons company, it included a platoon of mortars. The 12 companies of an American regiment were lettered sequentially from A to M, with J omitted. A German regiment's companies were numbered from 1 to 12. The German regiment had a horse-drawn 13th Company armed with short-range, close-support artillery pieces. The U.S. regiment had an organic cannon company with the same mission. Each regiment had as well an anti-tank company, number 14 in the German regiment, with a dozen guns. The anti-tank company was the only fully motorized unit in a German regiment. During most of Biedermann's service with it, the 14th Company of the 437th was armed with 12 37mm high-velocity guns. These were equivalents, the originals indeed, of the pieces that the U.S. infantry would take into Tunisia in late 1942. Originally adopted in 1936, they were light enough to be moved by hand for short distances. That was about their only virtue as an anti-tank weapon by mid-1941. The little 37mm rounds bounced off Russian tank armor so often that the gun won the dubious nickname of Army Door Knocker. especially against the T-34s and the heavy KVs that came into service in the first 6 months of the Russo-German War. German anti-tank crews had to depend on holding their fire to point-blank range and aiming for a vulnerable spot like a turret ring, or allowing the tank to pass and trying for a side or rear flank. Either was a high-risk option, demanding steel nerves and split-second timing from every man in the crew. This tactical point is significant because the towed anti-tank gun was, for most of the war in the East, the backbone of German anti-armor defense. In sharp contrast to a U.S. infantry division usually able to count on an attached battalion of tanks and another of self-propelled tank destroyers, the German division had at best a couple of dozen improvised self-propelled guns at division level. The rest was up to the pack gunners of the infantry regiments. Later in the war, the 37mm gave way first to a 50mm, then to a 75 or 76mm gun, with correspondingly more effect on Russian tanks and assault guns. But the mindset required by the gunners and the infantry alongside whom they fought remained the same. If the German Lanza of World War II was as formidable at close quarters as any soldier in history, it was in good part because he had no choice. After his return from officer training in 1943, Biedermann was not reassigned to the packs. Instead, he commanded infantry units whose armament and dynamics had changed significantly since 1941. As was the case in the U.S. Army, a rifle company's building block was the Gruppe, or squad. American infantry tactics depended on the individual rifleman and his semi-automatic M1 Garand. The automatic rifle organic to each squad was a support weapon. A German squad, however, was built around its light machine gun, and the MG-42 plays a prominent part in the second half of Biedermann's narrative. In defense or attack, the rest of the squad, with their bolt-action Mausers, were expected to cover the gun crew and keep them supplied with ammunition. As long as the guns stayed in action, the position had a chance of holding out against anything but overwhelming numbers, or tanks. With its high rate of fire and its quick-change barrel, the MG-42 compensated, at least in part, for the declining strength of frontline German units. Anybody able to scrounge one discarded his turn-of-the-century rifle for a submachine gun, either the German MP-40 or one of its Russian counterparts. The latter were popular for their ruggedness, their reliability, and not least for their difference, despite the risks of their distinctive sound drawing friendly fire. The AK-47 would acquire similar status for similar reasons among Americans in Vietnam. Beginning in 1943, the hard-pressed German infantry also began receiving deliveries of the world's first assault rifle, the Sturmgewehr. With a smaller, lighter cartridge than its predecessors, it was capable of full automatic fire and proved resistant to the worst of weather conditions. Never standard issue, it was nevertheless available even in an ordinary formation like the 132nd. Though Biedermann does not say so, it is logical to assume that he took a little advantage of his rank and made sure he had one of them most of the time. The German infantry division had another unit foreign to its U.S. counterpart, a depot or replacement battalion. That too was part of a comprehensive policy. Germany was divided into 21 military districts, and each division of the Wehrmacht was assigned one of those districts as the source of its replacements. The districts were small enough to facilitate regional identity, and large enough to prevent a particular town or district from losing most of its young men in the event of a catastrophe, as was the case with the British PALS battalions of 1916. The 132nd Division began its life as a South Bavarian formation from District 7. Then it was transferred to District 12, including the Eifel, the Palatinate, the Saar, and after 1940, the re-annexed province of Lorraine, where Biedermann reported after completing his officer training. In principle, recruits, recovered wounded, or men sent back for specialized courses would report to the depot of their regiment and from there be dispatched to the front, usually in organized detachments. Reporting to the divisional depot battalion, they would be sent forward as needed. progressed, this system eroded. Men were assigned from any depot to any unit needing them, or thrown together in improvised battle groups to meet emergencies. The regional identities of regiments and divisions eroded, as Biedermann's text indicates. Nevertheless, the concept of maintaining unit identity as far as possible never completely disappeared. To the end of the war, that cohesion contributed significantly to the German Army's frontline effectiveness, especially improvised formations, like the one Biedermann was periodically assigned to command. What he describes as an assault reserve or an alarm company was an ad hoc battle group that acted as an emergency strike force. Usually built around the regimental pioneer platoon, it might include cooks, clerks, walking wounded, stragglers, the sort of men few U.S. officers would choose for dangerous missions, even if they were the only ones available. But the 437th Infantry's sad sacks restored many a desperate tactical situation in the war's final months. Never did soldiers fight better than Gottlob Biedermann, the men of the 132nd Division, and the millions of others in Wehrmacht field gray. And never did soldiers fight in a worse cause. Were Biedermann and his comrades, as they so often insist, ordinary men doing their duty in extraordinary times? Were the obscene realities of Adolf Hitler's rule something remote from them? Here, certainly, are no stories of massacred prisoners or murdered civilians. Instead, Biedermann is at some pains to describe the peasants of the Crimea. He repeatedly insists that captured Russians were treated correctly. Within the text's few connections to the Holocaust is Biedermann's description of the vicious seesaw fighting in a Jewish cemetery near Leningrad, an irony that was probably lost to Biedermann and his men as they struggled to survive in an unforgiving milieu. Nor does Biedermann's text portray the ideological intensity described in general terms by Stefan Fritz and Omer Barkov as characteristic of the Wehrmacht. That is the intro of the memoir incorporating 50 years reflection, as well as 4 years experience. It would be unusual for a self-defined, ordinary German seeking to tell the truth that he remembers to affirm at this distance the everyday importance of National Socialism in sustaining morale and military effectiveness. Similarly, numerous moments of disillusion, pessimism, and cynicism need not be taken at face value. The closest Biedermann comes to affirming an ideology is his uncritical assumption that because the Germans were better soldiers than the Russians, they were also better human beings. Far from being simple and irrational, Adolf Hitler is as remote to the men of the 437th as the Germany he rules. And yet these two subtexts combine to tell a true war story. By whatever blend of intention and memory, In Deadly Combat is a narrative of encapsulation. Biedermann's world is his unit, his comrades, the outfit, der Haufen. The folk community becomes a set of images, in worn photographs and fading memories. Germany's mission in the East was reduced to survival in the face of overwhelming odds. Even comradeship becomes constructed. One of the more horrifying set pieces in this memoir is Biedermann's account of the military expedition. The original plan was stealing food and cigarettes from his unit's mail. Certainly no small matter in any army at any time. But that offense was so serious that the thief committed premeditated murder rather than face being reported. What in the U.S. or British armies was a minor offense, Wehrmacht was part of a disciplinary so brutal that in the course of World War II it executed 15,000 of its own men. It sentenced more than 100,000 to prison terms of over a year. It condemned thousands more to penal battalions, where conditions were, in the words of that, as the distinguished historian Manfred Messerschmitt once said, is what the Nazis called people's community. Modern war's depersonalization and objectification of enemies are described as a precondition for dehumanization. which in turn is a necessary first step to killing, whether on the battlefield, behind the lines, or in a concentration camp. But objectification requires interaction. To dehumanize someone, it is necessary to see him. War also isolates, creating environments where everything outside some vital center is perceived through a soldier's equivalent of Sylvia Plath's bell jar. By the end of Biedermann's narrative, the Russians are less depersonalized than invisible. The Germans have become decivilized. The survivors of the 437th Infantry resemble nothing so much as a prehistoric band huddling around a fire, staring blindly into it as a talisman inside the small circle of light. Dennis Showalter. Chapter 1. The March Toward the East. If there exists anything I can courage to face destiny unflinchingly. Bible. 30 June 1941. A summer soldiers riding the endless plains of eastern Poland, and only the movement of the train swaying slightly beneath us brought us relief from rain. The heavily laden transport moved slowly through ragged pine forests and stretches of sandy, uncultivated land, and we passed tiny farms and villages and crossed meandering rivers on the way. Except for children, who occasionally waved across the roadsides, we were ignored by the men and women in drab clothing whom we observed from a distance, getting lost in shimmering heat as the wheels of the Reichsbahn moved farther behind us. We passed the hours sitting, lying under a cloudless sky, as we set forth weapons and means. In contrast to following the peacetime regulations that had previously dominated our lives, we were permitted to loosen the first button of our gray-green uniforms and roll back the sleeves for what little comfort we could enjoy in the sweltering heat. The initial news of the war with Russia was several days old, and we spoke little about the prospects of becoming involved in the fighting. Everyone was confident that this war against the Soviet Union, like the conflict with France and Poland, would pass quickly. At dawn, the walls and towers of Krakow, the holy city of Poland where the heart of Pilsudski lies within the cathedral, appeared. The transport slowly screeched to a halt beside a dusty rail switching station, and within seconds we were ringed by a band of disheveled children who were ignored by the stone-faced military whose sentries standing about. "Bitte draw, Herr," they cried plaintively, with dirty hands grasping eagerly for the morsels we passed to them from our bread bags. We were permitted I passed a slice of bread to an enterprise. It had been printed the previous day in German and Polish, and it was possible to read the first news about the operation of peace. Advance on Lemberg, Gridno, Brest-Litovsk, Vilno, Kovno, and Dünavur had quickly fallen into German hands. Ecstatic headlines announced that more than 2,582 Soviet aircraft and 1,297 Soviet tanks had been destroyed. Soviet-occupied Poland was being freed from the Bolshevik yoke. The military police soon sprang to action with whistles and shouts, gesturing for us to reboard our transport, and we piled back onto the train. Railcars groaned in protest and strained against the weight, and we began to move slowly forward as I read the contents of the newspaper aloud to our gun crew, all of whom lay listlessly, disinterested on the flat rail platform. I glanced up from my reading and gazed back on the rail platform, now occupied only by the ragged band of children, and our journey toward unknown destiny. On July 1st, we came to a stop 10 kilometers west of Telkina near Yaroslavl, where we dismounted and proceeded eastward, the infantry forming a long column on foot, the unenviable fate of every infantry. Our anti-tank truck moved ahead of us, pulled by a Cheniette draft vehicle captured during the French campaign. Our senses were immediately struck by the lingering smell of smoke and ashes. Soon we could observe the large craters and scorched vehicles that depicted the handiwork of the German scuba dive bombers. We eventually filed to a halt in a temporary roadside canteen, where under the watchful eyes of the ever-present military police, Swabian Red Cross nurses drew cold coffee from a horse-drawn field kitchen and ladled it into our outstretched canteen. In vain they asked questions about recent news from home. We proceeded in a long gray column, leaving the Red Cross nurses behind, and marched farther toward the east. As dusk settled on us, we located vehicles and ducked beneath the shelter of a small file of trees that sparsely lined the road. Camouflage was ordered, and we attempted to cover our position with thin branches. At dawn, we were overtaken by supply trucks rolling along an arterial road, running toward the distant sunrise. We spent another day following in the tracks of the supply unit, and late in the afternoon we encountered the enemy for the first time. The dusty road was lined with endless mountains of Russian lines, ragged, tacky-brown heading in the opposite direction. Many of those without caps wore wisps of straw or rags tied to their close-cropped heads as protection against the burning sun, and some were barefooted and half-dressed, giving us an indication of how quickly our attacking forces had overrun their positions. By their strange mixture of clothing, they appeared to us to be barely soldiers, representing a mixture of white Russians, dark-skinned Caucasians, Kyrgyzs, Uzbeks, nomads with Mongolian features, an influx of people from the two continents covered by Soviet Russia. They filed past us silently and with downcast eyes. Occasionally, several of them could be seen supporting another who appeared to be suffering from wounds, sickness, or exhaustion. In school, we had been taught that the Urals separated Europe from Asia. However, here we saw Asia in what we believed to be the heart of Europe. The long column of misery disappeared behind us, and as darkness descended, we came to a halt. Beneath a star-covered sky, we wrapped ourselves in camouflage-printed shelter quarters, not to awaken until dawn. The 13th Panzerjäger Company was assigned as the forward advance unit, and at precisely 0500 we marched. The crumbling ruins of burned-out houses stood as mute witnesses to the fighting that the city of Yaroslav experienced during the Polish campaign, which, although only 2 years hence, seemed a lifetime ago. With the crossing of the San River in Vladimir, we had Russian soil beneath our feet. We passed a large German cemetery from World War I with a faded wooden sign above the entrance, to the memory of those comrades who fell at Dubrovnica. Our column was not permitted to stop long to examine the graves, and little did we realize how many cemeteries of our own would line the roadsides deep into Russia. We soon encountered fresh mounds of earth marked by rough birch crosses, topped with the unmistakable steel helmets of the German Wehrmacht. These first silent, bloody witnesses of the Highland tanks were arranged in regulation rows and columns, and we attempted to divert our gaze, but were always drawn back to the graves. We marched on without speaking, and the silent red-brown mountain seemed to beckon us, as if to say, "Do not leave us here. Do not abandon us." Faint artillery fire can be heard from the direction of Lemberg. The condition of the road became steadily worse, and dust settled thickly on the Lancers, horses, and vehicles. Only the dim silhouette of the vehicle ahead of our platoon was visible as the sun stood like an orange globe in its zenith, barely penetrating the choking clouds of dust. Sweat and dirt combined to create bizarre shapes on the faces peering through the heavy green helmets. Near Krakowica, we again combined shelter quarters to tent and spent the night. Our odyssey into the void continued as we advanced toward an unknown destination. We encountered primitive villages lining the road, and Russian women and children peered at us intently from the shadows of doorways and gazed at us through the protection of rough-hewn window panes. The only men to be seen were ancient veterans of other wars. The people of the villages would tell us of the Bolsheviki, the menace and terror of the Siberian penal camps could be seen in the eyes of these people as they spoke, and they told us that pictures of Christ and Stalin hung in schools. When the village teachers asked, "Whom do you thank for your daily bread?" the children would be compelled to answer, "Stalin." We were relieved that we were experiencing firsthand the effects of communism, and that what we were hearing could not simply be attributed to our own propaganda. Niedermeyer remarked, "After having seen Russia, we now know how fortunate we are to be Germany." On July 5th, we moved to Lemberg. The city had been heavily hit twice during the First World War, and the early morning haze revealed burned-out factories, ruined homes, and destroyed tanks with greasy black smoke billowing from the still-hot carcasses. In one of the few partially intact sectors of the city, a long line of people waited in front of bread people. They stared at us with listless eyes as we passed. The Russian air base at Lemberg had been rendered unusable by the Stukas. Blackened aircraft and smashed equipment were scattered throughout the area, and during a pause on our march, soldiers wandered among the wreckage, photographing one another alongside destroyed Soviet planes, and curiously, ever mindful of strict regulations against looting or the non-authorized requisition of captured enemy equipment. The war with the Soviet Union being only 10 days underway, we still observed anything associated with the Soviet Union with curiosity. Our march continued through the first half of July. For days, great numbers of destroyed Russian tanks lined our path. Capsized prime movers and field guns were scattered along the roadsides. In the field, one could see numerous abandoned Russian artillery positions that appeared to be intact, indicating how quickly our offensive had overtaken the Soviet defenders. We were astonished at how well motorized the Soviet army was, as our own artillery was represented primarily by horse-drawn equipment reminiscent of World War I. The graves of German and Russian soldiers were now found to be close together, the German graves marked with rough-hewn wooden crosses to the right of the road, the Russians to the left. The Russian graves remained nameless, marked only with rifles and bayonets stuck into the fresh earth. The customary steel helmets, while some of the crosses of identification from linen string, waiting to be collected and filed. On July 8th, as we neared the road on a wide, rough road, we passed supply units and cable layers of the 71st Division of the 6th Army. The cable layers advised us that the division had taken Lemberg with 600 casualties, and confidently reported that the war was to end within several weeks. Our advance halted on the old Russian-Galician border. We expected to encounter strong enemy opposition when the 6th and 17th Armies reached the Stalin Line, a series of bunkers and heavily defended strongpoints. We were disappointed to learn that the 132nd Infantry Division had received the assignment to remain in reserve. Most of us were eager to see action before the inevitable surrender of the Soviet Union. 14 July passed without notice. Our existence remained marked by boredom. Our environment consisted of 100-meter-wide transport roads, dust, mud, burning heat, thunderstorms, and an endless open space, with only occasional clusters of sparse trees stretching to the horizon. Thatched rooftops of the collective farms could be seen in the distance, and we concentrated on them, like palms on a desert, to guide us to primitive wells. We had received word that the wells were often poisoned by the Red Army in retreat. Skeletal remains of horses left a lingering stench along our path. The smell would remind us forever of the Soviet paradise into which we found ourselves marching. The advance slowed as we crossed through Yampol. Occasionally, we were lucky enough to obtain a few onions and carrots from the villages that lined our path. More rarely, a chicken or a couple of eggs served to augment the monotonous field rations. We reflected with longing on our time spent in Kärnten and Zagreb before the onslaught against the Russians began, as there we had enjoyed cold beer and soup. The infantry continued to march from sunrise to sunset. Dusty, sweaty, and clammy, without relief from the brutal climate, we penetrated deeper into Soviet Russia. A although it was against regulations, small pannier carts, pulled by stout Russian ponies, were requisitioned to lighten the load of our field packs. As we left civilization as we knew it farther behind us, this habit became more commonplace. The sparse human habitation was primitive and probably lice-ridden, so nights were spent in tents, haystacks, or more often bare earth, sleeping rolled in the ever-useful shelter. We awakened at dawn by the nuzzling of hungry and thirsty horses. We passed wood-framed schoolhouses, which were little more than rough halls decorated with the characteristic red stars and red-painted podiums for political gatherings of the Communist Party. Tattered, dusty pictures of Stalin and Lenin hung on the walls, and Stalin had introduced compulsory schooling where previously, during the era of the Tsar, the alphabet was hardly known. We were surprised that school children could speak some broken German, and from captured propaganda material, we learned that political education was a priority for the team. On the 17th of July, we received mail from home for the first time since our advance had begun, and 10 days later the division entered the Ukraine and marched over Kasatin in a southeast direction toward Bucha. The Ukraine steamed inside. Over wide sandy roads and on pavement of rough stones, we came into a land of unending horizons. Endless wide steppes and grain and sunflower fields bordered our way toward the east. Primitive wooden windmills dotted the horizon, used them as our drink and rest stations during the lonely march through a land that left us with unforgettable impressions of passing through the realms of space. We came to a halt in an unkempt acacia grove that offered sparse shade and an ocean of grass. The company had marched 60 kilometers in less than 24 hours on painful, torn and bruised. Dusty and channeled with streaks of sweat, faces drowned by wind and the sun peered from under heavy helmets to observe our going. Hands slippery with sweat gripped the trenching rings to tear holes in the earth. Command was given. Dig in. Stripped to the waist, we hacked at the earth without speaking, and nearby the singing of bees reminded me of their own claimants of the air, decided to locate the source of the bees in search of honey. Equipped with mess tins and armed with shelter porters and gas masks, as we disappeared behind the gun position for a collective bomb. After an hour of labor, I had constructed, to the left of the pack position, a regulation earthwork, the high side facing our front, on which we would lay our rifles and grenades. Anti-tank guns stood well concealed in branches and grass near the edge of the grove. A sandy road cut through the open field before us in an east-west direction, and in the shimmering heat of the afternoon sun, the silhouettes of huts in a distant village were visible on the horizon. To the left of the road, Private Good had placed his half-track to the rear of the position to be hidden by the acacia grove, and he set to work camouflaging his path. Forward observers from the artillery and the mortar units moved ahead to their observation points, with rolls of communication cables strapped to their backs. Only the occasional clatter of an entrenching tool, canteen cup, or mess tin broke the stillness of a seemingly peaceful world. Folding my dusty tunic under my head for a pillow, I had just begun to doze in the afternoon sun, when a rifle shot broke the afternoon silence. In one motion I rolled into the freshly dug foxhole, clapped on the heavy steel helmet, and brought my carbine to my shoulder. Staring forward, I could detect only emptiness and softly swaying grasses. During infantry defense drills, it had been hammered into us to shoot at every disturbance, every moving leaf and blade of grass, in order to kill the enemy. Now, with my heart pounding, thoughts raced through my mind. Would today be the day that I must kill another human being? Who shoots first? Who hits first, him or me? Must I kill today in order to save my own life and the lives of my comrades? I pictured the rows of graves we had passed during our march with carefully placed crosses, identification markers hanging from them, and tried to shake them from my mind. About 600 meters to the left of our position, the racing sound of rifle fire broke the stillness. sounding at first like the familiar popping of carbine fire at the training range. Soon wild shots snapped through the air and ricocheted above us. With burning eyes, we continued staring forward, but we noticed nothing unusual before our position. Through the rifle fire, the distinctive crack of an anti-tank gun sounded far in the distance. Within a few minutes, the incident was over. Dust and the acrid smell of burnt cordite drifted faintly in the air, and to our left an ugly black cloud billowed into the blue afternoon sky. We remained crouched in our positions. In hushed tones, and with hearts pounding with excitement, we tried to assess what had occurred. A short time later we learned through a courier that Pearl's anti-tank gun had knocked out a Soviet armored reconnaissance vehicle, and that an attack by a Russian rifle company had been repulsed. Little did we realize that in the months and years that lay before us, this short encounter would come to be considered as nothing more than a casual and insignificant brush with the enemy. And this first action of the regiment was little indication of the nightmarish years of fighting marked by deprivation, sorrow, and countless victims that lay before us. From this vast expanse, many of us would never return, but at the time, one didn't dwell on such thoughts. I turned to my diary, a small pocket-sized book bound in black oilcloth, the corners already ragged and the pages stained with sweat and rain, to recount the incident. The two drivers returned with mess tins dripping with honey, a satisfying addition to our evening rations. We ate the honey and hummus bread, welcoming the change from the usual ration of liver and blood sausage, and we washed the bread and honey down with cold tea before preparing another march at dawn. 30 July found us in bivouac, Mikhailovka. During the course of the previous days, some of the units had experienced attacks from Soviet bomber and fighter bomber squadrons, which had proven to be ineffective in slowing our attacks. The rifle companies and horse-drawn units marched throughout the night and covered about 65 kilometers to reach Kharkiv on the 31st of July. The nightly password was issued, and rumors circulated of a pending attack to take place the following morning at 0700 along a wide front. We passed the summer night wrapped in shelter quarters as we crouched in our grass-lined foxholes. The rumors held true as exactly at 0700, the 1st of August, we began our push forward toward the Soviet defenses near Mirovno. An immense open field lay before us, and our view extended over the steppe, which offered little protection save the gentle rolling terrain with shallow depressions invisible to the untrained eye. This presented a great advantage for the Soviets, for as defenders they were able to dig into the safety of the earth with a clear field of fire before their defenses. We made final preparations to abandon our positions and to move across the open steppe. With little effort, we brought the pack into position on the edge of a wheat field, which offered a wide field of fire facing eastward over the wavy green sea, interrupted only by sparse potato gardens. The first rays of the morning sun danced across the wheat stalks of the Ukraine, and through the morning haze we could recognize the distant silhouettes of two villages on the horizon. We sat on the gun carriage, drinking warm coffee in an attempt to dissipate the cold feeling within us. Everyone desired to appear nonchalant and spoke not close to the war, attempting through conversation to conceal the anxiety clearly etched in sunburned faces. Company officers gathered in tight circles several dozen meters away, speaking in low tones and glancing toward the enemy positions, occasionally raising field glasses to their eyes. At 0650 our artillery had opened fire. The heavy projectiles screamed over us en route to predetermined targets within the enemy positions, and the infantry, burdened with weapons, ammunition, communications equipment, and explosives, began to advance along a broad front. The movements seemed to follow as planned in exacting detail, giving an initial impression that nothing had taken place other than another training exercise at far Dugo. The captured French tractor clattered noisily up to our position. Limbering our gun, we climbed aboard and advanced, leaving a rising cloud of dust in our wake. We passed the armored reconnaissance vehicle knocked out by Pearl on the previous day, and our eyes were drawn to the macabre and still unfamiliar scene of a half-burned corpse hanging with naked torso from one of the hatches. The two anti-tank guns of the platoon lurched forward over the unburned ground, accompanying the advance along the sandy road toward Kharkov. The machine guns of the foremost infantry units were already engaged. The audible bursts of the MG-34s floated back to us over the wheat stalks. Behind us, mortar tubes and artillery pieces pounded with dull thumping, in contrast to the high-pitched bursts of small arms fire. Suddenly, ricochets were whistling and bouncing among us. We found ourselves scrambling for cover in the ruts and furrows of the road. "Take cover!" screamed the gun captain behind. Through the ever-increasing roar of every caliber, we could see his outstretched arms motioning and his lips moving. His commands remained drowned in the pounding thunder of weaponry. Finally, the moment had come. It was now our time to face the enemy. Despite the gnawing fear within us, we met the inevitable with profound relief, which served to demonstrate how our priorities had shifted since our march had begun. The gun crews automatically and mechanically set to work as they had done in drills countless times before. Gunners 1 and 2 loosened the livers upon the wheels. Gunners 3 and 4 spread the livers wide apart, while the aimer simultaneously adjusted the range by depressing the barrel to a horizontal position. The loader opened the bolt to the breech, and the handlers tossed cases of ammunition into the carriage. With one motion, the rifle snapped the open breech of the barrel to be smoothly loaded and locked, and the weapon was ready to fire. Hartmann knelt next to the gun with binoculars held to his eyes as he directed the aimer in textbook fashion. "Right end of the hedgerow, range 400, machine gun nest. Fire!" Within seconds, one round after another was leaving the barrel in response to his practiced commands. We were able to observe an infantry platoon from the company as it became in shallow depression under heavy fire from enemy machine guns. Cover fire was hot. Our rounds now struck directly within the enemy positions. The platoon worked its way forward. Clearly visible were the heavily laden infantrymen advancing slowly through the wheat fields. Thin wisps of smoke revealed where the dry stalks had been ignited by tracer fire. The collective farm at Klein Kharkov, which was reportedly occupied by Soviet artillery observers, was taken under fire by the second pot at a range of some 600 meters. Straw began to burn brightly, with thick black smoke rising into the clear sky. We received the command to shift positions. We advanced forward to the crossroads on the same bearing as the burning farmhouse. Through the bursts of impacting mortar rounds and the pounding of machine gun fire, we were conscious of the cheers erupting from our parched throats as we observed the Russians abandoning their positions. As they attempted to flee from the farm along the dusty road toward the east, our machine gunners increased their fire, and again the rapid-firing MG-34 Spandaus sent streams of copper-jacketed rounds into the fleeing clusters of khaki-brown figures. To our right, the first prisoners appeared with upraised hands and eyes wide with fright. They were quickly stripped of helmets and combat equipment, and they instinctively hurried toward our rear at a trot, with hands clasped behind their heads. While changing positions, our tracked vehicle parted its tread. The ship spun in an untimely half-circle and stopped, helplessly stuck in an open field within sight of the enemy. The drivers bailed out of the vehicle and desperately began to attempt repairs as we unhitched the gun and slipped into towing harnesses to pull it forward. The pack, designated as number 1 within our company, left us behind as it advanced, bouncing along the rough road toward the sound of firing. Sweat soaked through the gray-green uniforms and left a trail along faces, covered with dust and grime, as the Ukrainian summer sun beat upon the dull green helmets. Exhausted, we hung gasping and panting in towing harness as rifle shots cracked in a now familiar tone and plucked at the crusted dry road surface. Occasionally, tiny mushrooms of dust erupted in erratic lines along the road near us as bullets fired from a heavy machine gun situated on the east edge of Klein Kharkov impacted near us. With the protective armor shield facing forward, we again lunged against the harness to pull the gun farther, our faces strained with exertion and fear. An occasional ping clanged sharply against the armor as a bullet struck it like a hammer, a deadly reminder that we were still under fire from isolated snipers. Hotsman ran forward to reconnoiter suitable gun positions, some machine guns swinging from his neck and a hand grenade clenched in his right fist. He directed us toward the right and into the edge of a wheat field. As we left the road, we noticed a vague checkerboard pattern of fresh earth in the ruts where the Russians had blocked our advancement with their box-shaped monitors. Hotsman's reconnaissance had prevented us from straying into it. We paused to catch our breath in the sparse shadow of the steel gun shield. The trees, those buildings present to offer even faint relief from the burning midday sun. With heaving lungs, I fell on my hands and knees for a moment. Others collapsed into the furrows on the edge of the road in a vain attempt to find shade. Some merely stretched themselves on the Ukrainian earth. I remained vaguely aware of the bullets from the Maxim machine gun again cracking nearby, and the pounding of my heartbeat gradually slowed while I lay in the dirt. The deadly projectiles continued to snap and whine over us. The Russians attempted to zero in on our pursuing vehicle, now 100 meters distant from where our efforts had brought the gun. Fountains of earth were thrown skyward, and a thick cloud of gray smoke engulfed the Chenier as it was surrounded by impacting lines. Despite the hail of small arms fire snapping through the air about them, the drivers escaped unscathed and were able to repair the crash. Leaping into the driver's seat, Clemens slammed the transmission into gear, and with a racing engine, the vehicle lurched forward and bounced over the open ground toward us. The other gun, 100 meters to our left, opened fire in an attempt to knock out the Maxim. It then moved forward, the tractor crawling down the left side of the road, then turned sharply into an immense wheat field that stretched to the horizon. The machine gun continued to keep the tractor under fire, small caliber ammunition having little effect on the steel-plated skin of the vehicle. We greeted the arrival of our driver and the tractor with mixed emotions. We were desperate to shift positions, and the prime mover would now pull the heavy gun. However, we were fully aware that the vehicle would draw additional fire from the enemy positions. The thought of abandoning the gun in order to find shelter from the enemy fire flashed through my mind, but I just as quickly eliminated the unthinkable option and strained harder against the harness. Within a few seconds that seemed to last an eternity, the gun was hitched and under tow by the tractor, the motor screaming in protest as the gun bounced behind us over the uneven ground. The Russians had pulled their artillery fire closer to their own lines, and the heavy projectiles of high explosives crept ever nearer to us, impacting among the most forward units. The incoming rounds shook the earth beneath us, though with great effort to hear the shouting commands above the explosion. The 7th Company, to the left of us, had become engaged in heavy fighting. As we advanced, the Russians began to scramble from their positions to flee through the wheat fields toward Kargali, some 500 meters distant. Our forward machine gun crews fired their MG-34s while standing over each island. Barrels rested across the shoulder of the crew in order to maintain a clear field of fire. A number of the Russians were struck by the bursts of machine gun fire and tumbled to the earth, disappearing among the wheat stalks. As we moved forward, we came under sporadic rifle fire from a group of Soviets who later surrendered, moving toward us with upraised arms, fear and exhaustion clearly etched in their faces. The day's objective, a railway embankment in front of the village, had been reached. 12 kilometers of territory were won in 6 hours of difficult fighting, and my thoughts dwelled on the insignificance of 12 kilometers. 12 kilometers in an endless land where unbroken fields stretched to the horizon before us from sunrise to sunset. I wondered how many more 12-kilometer battles lay ahead of us during our march away. We came upon one of our casualties lying motionless in the dirt on the road, his helmet still secured tightly to his head, sightless eyes staring into the sky. Russian prisoners were quickly employed to carry the wounded to a field dressing station. Escorted by our lightly wounded who marched along the edge of the road, the pitiful column wound toward the 2nd Battalion collection point to our rear. Thus, the regiment experienced its first clash with the enemy, and we had suffered our first losses as well. With no joy of victory in our ranks, the feeling of excitement quickly drained away to be replaced by an overwhelming sadness and longing to leave. As yet, we had not experienced the true effects of prolonged warfare, which becomes an environment that sets aside all former bonds of family and culture, and irretrievably replaces them with bonds of the comrade at your side. That was to come in the weeks, months, and years ahead. The journalists assigned to the propaganda company would write colorful reports on what had taken place, and would also add that the dead and wounded had done their duty in service to the Führer and the fatherland. Our gun crew was assigned to perform a security detail. As dust fell to position the gun along the road, the battalion defense line. The isolated bursts of impacting mortar rounds echoed over the trees and seemed to chase the sun as it sank slowly in the west. Our thoughts followed the sinking fiery ball penetrating the evening haze to the horizon, and we thought of our homeland, whose borders lay 1,500 kilometers behind us. The front refused to sleep at night. Reconnaissance units from both opposing forces remained on the move, slipping through the darkness to locate the enemy positions. Again and again the Russian Maxim fire broke forth through the darkness, always answered by the ripping sound of our Spandau MG-34s, quickly joined by erratic rifle fire. The occasional detonation of hand grenades and the sharp reports of submachine guns drifted across the fields, and for long moments the defensive lines would be illuminated by glowing colors, arcing skyward to hang sizzling above the line. In the early morning hours, we were withdrawn from the sector and deployed 2 kilometers to the south in preparation for another attack. 2 August was marked by a break in the monotonous field rations when we boiled freshly dug potatoes in an unnamed Ukrainian village. Oberschütze had already plucked a chicken, and together with the boiled hen and potatoes, we ate peeled cucumbers. Several hundred meters along the approach to the village on a small rise was Unteroffizier Eigner's burned-out half-track. During the previous day's fighting, he had driven directly into a well-concealed minefield, where the 3 men of the gun crew met their deaths. 2 of the crew members were killed instantly. The anti-tank mine had severed both of Eigner's legs, and he had died that night at the medical collecting point. Their helmets could be seen, clustered beneath a birch cross near the destroyed half-track. Their graves added to the mounting casualties the war in the Soviet Union was costing the German army. Not far from their rough gravesite was a row of several dozen box mines dug up by the engineers. The soldiers had long since found an appropriate name for the dead little boxes, referring to them as Kinderserve. Word passed through the ranks of the infantry of how the division chaplain, Zatska, had risked his life to recover some of the men who fell wounded before the enemy during the previous day's fighting. We remained ever conscious of how we were being treated as we lived every day. Many of the soldiers who had not previously been so prominent began to with the growing consciousness of our own mortality, we became more aware of the presence of the chaplain. As our casualties continued to mount, the chaplain, who wore no insignia of rank in the German army, came to play a significant role in our lives. He would offer the last voice of reassurance and the last vestige of punishment. Our lines of supply and as our momentum slowed to a crawl, we continued to experience ever-increasing sporadic shelling. Once my gas mask and entrenching tool were ripped away by a shell splinter, and my fingers torn as well. But other than a bruise on my hip, I escaped. The Russian rearguard elements continued to withdraw, attempting to burn many of the few mud and straw huts in our path, and always leaving an ever-present cadre of snipers, who slowly extracted a deadly price from our ranks at the cost of their own lives. On the 3rd of August, we spent most of the night lying in the middle of a turnip. At length, a reconnaissance platoon that a still intact collective line, some 5 kilometers distant, was free of enemy troops, and in the early pre-dawn hours we advanced to the tiny collection of huts. The company kitchen sent forward hot coffee and schmaltzbrot. Our gun crew built one of the small thatched roof huts, and we piled straw onto the mud floor and dozed for several hours, thankful that we were not still alive for the turnips. The following day, we advanced farther toward the east until our forward reconnaissance reported having reached the wide Dnieper River. The immense bulk of the Soviet army seemed to have evaporated, and victory appeared all but certain as we neared the banks of the Dnieper. For weeks our routine had consisted of endless marching, interrupted only by sporadic resistance from small bands of Soviet stragglers overtaken by our advanced units. The occasional enemy dead now attracted little attention, and prisoners became a common sight, always rising from the terrain to approach us cautiously with upraised arms. Most often they would be simply disarmed and motioned toward the rear, often unescorted, to be collected by the reserve column. The evening of the 5th of August found us in recently constructed defensive positions before Velikaya Pritsky. The ominous thunder of heavy shelling continued without pause, as our artillery countered the enemy beyond the horizon. We waited nervously throughout the night for our offensive, which was to begin the next morning. Our attack was launched at precisely 0550, with the Dnieper as the objective. Our artillery batteries fired smoke and high explosives onto a commanding height designated Hill 197, and from our position we could observe many of the enemy troops fleeing through the clouds of smoke enveloping the terrain features. Prisoners later stated that many of the Soviet troops had fled, panic-stricken out of fear that we had used poison gas against their stronghold, and indeed sightings of enemy troops donning gas masks during the attack had been reported. Within hours, the ridge was captured by the infantry with minimal losses. At 0850, the enemy fought a deadly delaying action back to Hill 160, from where they continued to offer dogged resistance from carefully prepared positions. Interrogations of exhausted prisoners indicated that the heavy concentrations of artillery fire were instrumental in draining the will of the defenders. In the late afternoon, our own forces came under attack from squadrons of fighter bombers who inflicted little damage. On the morning of the 7th of August, we labored to dig defensive positions in the earth. About 100 meters from our position, the wide Dnieper was visible, and we engaged in burrowing into the earth as quickly as possible in anticipation of fighter-bomber attacks, as well as for protection from Soviet gunboats on the river. Within hours, heavy mortar rounds fired from boats maneuvering on the Dnieper began to impact on the slopes near us. A gun from the 1st platoon attempted to take one of the boats under fire without success, and our positions along the riverbanks were blinded by enemy mortar and artillery fire. Despite our extensive preparations, forced to withdraw from the inflicted by an enemy beyond our reach. In this sector, we found ourselves facing an enemy who held superiority in heavy weapons, and our own artillery units were now compelled to ration ammunition because of our strained supply lines. The depth of our penetration into the Soviet Union began to take its toll, and ammunition rationing served as a first indication of the shortages that we were to encounter with disastrous results in future battles. The distant thunder of far-off heavy guns resounded faintly in our ears, and was quickly followed by the roar of impacting projectiles echoing over the open terrain. The evening brought more attacks from the Ratas flying low over our positions, passing over us in what appeared to be no pattern of attack. We attempted to repel them with rifles and light machine guns, with little effect. One evening I observed 2 rations carriers from the artillery battery located behind us moving along the lower part of the ridge toward the front. The soldier in the lead carried the cylindrical thermos canister in a harness on his back, and they picked their way through the broken ground and the growing twilight, plodding slowly forward over undulating terrain, torn by artillery shells, and made soft and muddy from the intermittent thunderstorms. Suddenly we were forced once again to dive for cover, as a rata began a surprise descent upon us from a low-hanging cloud bank, and the two oncoming figures scrambled for shelter behind the wall of one of the mud huts at the edge of the village. The plane loosed a burst of fire into the village as it passed overhead, before disappearing into the gray thunderheads as quickly as it had appeared. Moments later, the two men could again be seen making their way past our position. They picked their way through the morass with difficulty, one following closely behind the other, curses clearly audible in the still air. The second man had slung his carbine and was holding both free hands against the sides of the canister in an attempt to salvage the remaining portion of their day's ration. The steel container had been cleanly punctured by a round from the aircraft's board gun, and the projectile had gone through the sides of the canister, leaving the hot contents pouring in twin streams on the ground. Dodging the shell traces in the evening twilight, they wound their way through the muddy and torn earth toward the waiting men in the battery position. Still swearing and cursing the ratas and Ivan, they stumbled slowly forward toward their destination. The soup for the artillery battery was to be carefully rationed that night, but however sparse the quantity, it would still be preferred over the monotonous iron rations of wurst and hard bread we were often compelled to consume while on the march. On the evening of the 9th of August, we were treated to Schweinebraten, brought forward from the field station by couriers, and the following morning we deployed forward again. The enemy had attempted to push armored units through a sector held by a neighboring division, and elements of the 68th and our 132nd Infantry were ordered to reinforce the sector. The march was ordered for 0800. In preparation for the march, we were provided with coffee and schmaltzbrot. Despite the sickening odor of a dead horse that permeated the air from the edge of the road, we enjoyed the first meal since being treated to Schweinebraten early in the evening of the previous day. During our short pause, a band of Stukas flew over us, and we were able to observe them break from their formation and dive like hawks on unseen prey. The screaming aircraft sirens threw panic and confusion throughout the enemy ranks as the Stukas dropped their bombs into the columns of Russian tanks and troop concentrations hidden from our view behind the terrain features. Clouds of black smoke mushroomed skyward through the still air, marking the locations of the vehicles that had fallen victim to the dive bombers. The Russians soon retaliated with air attacks of their own. Not having had time to prepare defensive positions, we dove for cover in the shallow depressions in the ground, only to be bypassed by the enemy aircraft. Behind us, some bombs fell near a medical collection point without causing casualties. On the 12th of August, our pilots dropped artillery ammunition to the batteries in our rear area. The artillery units had fired ceaselessly while repelling the heavy Soviet counterattacks during the previous days, and the air observers reported that the Soviets were pulling their forces back toward the east, over the Dnieper near Kanev. Our own units continued to press attacks, but enemy resistance had stiffened, and we gained little ground. My gun was situated near a railway embankment to secure the rail lines running toward Kanev and over the Dnieper. The front in our sector had remained quiet throughout the afternoon, and Hartmann and I set out on a short reconnaissance of our area. Beyond the rail line, in an easterly direction along the edge of a small grove of trees, we suddenly found ourselves staring into the muzzle of a Maxim machine gun, not 10 meters distant. Concealed beneath the shadows of low-lying branches, a blood-soaked figure in a khaki uniform was draped motionless over the gun carriage, as if resting. Quietly releasing the safety catches of our submachine guns, we gingerly edged forward, surveying the scene before us. Lying closely together in a jagged row along the railway embankment, we found a group of about 30 dead Russians. From their position, it was obvious that during the previous day's fighting, a burst from a tank or aircraft machine gun had caught the platoon in a flanking fire, killing or wounding all of them instantly. I slowly slipped forward to examine one of the casualties, and observed that the lifeless hand of one of the corpses still grasped an open package containing a field bandage. The badly wounded Russian had vainly attempted to bandage himself, but, unable to staunch the flow of blood, had slowly died where he lay. His tunic was unbuttoned to the waist, his uniform black with the encrusted blood from a fatal wound. My gaze wandered from the first figure and fell upon a corpse wearing the uniform of a sergeant. The NCO was grasping one of the wheels of the Maxim carriage, his sightless eyes peering forward at the ammunition belt where it fed into the chamber of the weapon. Another held his rifle clenched